Welcome to Oxford Analytica's weekly outlook on key trends in the global political economy. I'm Tom Wales, OA's Director of Analysis. I'm joined by Graham Hutchings, our Managing Director, to discuss, our clients won't be surprised to hear, the situation on the Korean peninsula. Graham, the key question here is how much, if anything, the Chinese government can do to rein in the North Korean regime. China is, of course, the only state with anything like reasonable relations with Pyongyang. What do we know about the Chinese view of North Korea and their likely response to this latest round of misbehavior?
What we know is that the apparent realities of the situation, that China is the principal provider of energy, food and much assistance, that China has a mutual defense treaty, that Chinese troops were involved in the preservation, to some extent the genesis even of North Korea, that they should have a client state, that they should have somebody up against their borders who does their bidding in one form or another. They've obviously got something very different from a client state. They've got somebody who can create such a hullabaloo that it shakes the very foundations of their own strategic view and their sense of the need, particularly on that frontier, for stability and calm. So we have here one of the mysteries of international politics, not without precedent by reference perhaps to other relationships, where, as the saying goes, the tail wags the dog. We are familiar in other contexts of small countries able to exercise a sway over the foreign policy of larger entities on whom they depend, to the disadvantage of those large entities. Now here we see that in a particularly concentrated and intense form. So in sum, the Chinese must be frustrated, anxious, and worried about the extent to which young Kim can really impair their strategic outlook, not only on the peninsula, but further afield.
Now, another key aspect of Beijing's irritation must be the response of the United States and its allies to the behavior of the North Korean regime. This has included redeploying missile defense systems, tightening alliance cooperation on military power projection, and even revision of the Japanese constitution, which is part of the political program of the current Japanese government, the new LDP government. So, what does this all mean for China's strategic position in the region?
I think it has to be regarded as a sharp deterioration, because all of these knots that you've referred to have been tightened. All these linkages have been renewed and strengthened. And we know that when the South Koreans, but more particularly when the Japanese, and to some extent when the United States refers to the North Korean problem in East Asia, they're referring essentially to the Chinese problem. It's only that bit further behind. It's the name that never gets dared spoken in Japanese security literature in quite the way that is really implied. So you're absolutely right. This is bringing about scenarios of the worst kind for the Chinese perspective. But to switch the argument round the other way, for all its riskiness and its undesirability, there is a sense, I suppose, in which the United States, in that context of wider strategic tussle with China, hopes to be a beneficiary of what's going on.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I think when it comes to an event like this, where we've seen many iterations of this sort of behavior by the North Korean regime, that is escalation of rhetoric and military posturing, which eventually leads to a declaration of victory on the part of North Korea, negotiations, and some kind of payoff, usually involving food aid for North Korea's frequently starving population. It's very easy for analysts like us to say, actually, we've seen this story before, it always ends the same way, therefore our clients should not be concerned at all. There are certain things that are different about the latest situation. One is that North Korea is a more secure nuclear power. Its latest two nuclear tests earlier in the year were actually successful, unlike previous tests, which were judged to be failures.
Not quite the joke it once was.
No, not quite the punchline that it once was, yes. And it's also true that the U.S. posture towards Asia has changed under the so-called pivot. The State Department hates to use that term, but undoubtedly U.S. military power is being reoriented towards Asia. The administration has made very clear that the current sequester cuts to the defense budget will not affect the Pacific theater. And this has quite a lot to do with China and China's growing regional sway and the U.S. role in maintaining security in the region, its self-perceived role of maintaining security in the region. And North Korea provides a stalking horse for this kind of reorientation by Washington. It is, in some ways, the perfect excuse.
It's a great cover.
Exactly, for strategic repositioning that we'd expect to happen anyway, and in this case has been accelerated.
So how is the situation resolved if one thinks about outcomes and moves to calm the situation? Are there some bones that can be thrown to the North Koreans, to use a somewhat graphic analogy? Is there a possibility of a Sino-US approach that achieves objectives? Where's the sense of movement and direction here?
Well, what the U.S. won't do is what the North Koreans want, and that is they won't engage on a purely bilateral basis with North Korea in the absence of some kind of major concession by North Korea out of all order of magnitude with previous concessions. The most likely scenario is North Korea does what it has always done, and that is declare victory, probably by shooting off a couple of missiles on the eldest Kim's birthday, which is approaching in a few days. That is Kim Il-sung's birthday. And it declares victory. Then it suggests it's open for talks. There's some kind of arrangement with the South Koreans for additional aid. The problem for the U.S. and South Koreans, and for the North Koreans themselves, is that its increasing technical progress on its nuclear program, while it's still not exactly a sure nuclear power, makes it harder for the U.S., South Korea, and Japan to countenance this sort of behavior. It makes it harder for an effective rapprochement. So I think we'll have a declaration of victory by the North Koreans and some kind of step away from the brink after some kind of gesture like another missile test. But that doesn't mean the situation is as stable as it was in the past. In fact, one could certainly say that regardless of the internal conditions in North Korea, which are always at least somewhat opaque, the situation is becoming more unstable. And we can't always be confident that the patterns that have held true in the past will continue to hold. And the situation will always, this kind of behavior will always be resolved peacefully.
Good point.
Thank you very much for joining us. Please join us again next week for another look at the global political economy.